The Carrion Call by Zzarchov Kowolski. Part 1. When he was a young man, he tried to have a secret tryst with the blacksmith's wife. He ended up rolling out the window and scurrying to the first hiding place he could find, a small nook inside the blacksmith's own forge. It was such a good hiding spot that even when the smith scoured the area, he could find no trace of the paramour, and so returned to work. In August, for 4 more hours. He was delirious in a pool of his own sweat by the time he could slink back to his own home. This, right now, was worse. The sun had been punishing him for 2 days to the point he hoped the flagellants were right and the suffering he endured would count as atonement for his sins. He had always had a weakness for the temporal world's pleasure, and he couldn't outrun the consequences of his vices forever. He was cast out of his community and had joined this ill-fated crusade in a last-ditch effort to enter the kingdom of heaven. He fucked that up too. He lost his nerve when the heathen raiders attacked in the hours before dawn. The crusade was over before it began, and he was too cowardly to die an honorable death with his countrymen. So here he was, lost in an endless sea of burning sand. Travel by night. Avoid the harsh sun of day. Great advice if you have somewhere else to be during the day. He had cast aside everything but his socks, sword, and underclothes at this point. He still clutched his canteen, more as a memory of hope than anything useful. It had been empty by the light of the first dawn. Off in the distance, he heard the screech of a hawk, as what might be his final bead of sweat ran down his forehead. He opened his eyes, having been unaware he had even closed them. Looking about in a daze and uneasy on his feet, he surveyed his surroundings. Had he stopped walking? He looked behind him to see fresh tracks, for what it mattered. He noticed something else, a shimmering in the distance, a mirage attempting to lure him to his doom. He turned and continued shuffling forward. He made it 2 steps before stopping again. That hawk needs water, and it's not like he's any more likely to find salvation an hour further into the sands. Chasing a mirage may be a fool's gambit, but those long odds beat a certain death an hour further into the sands. For the next hour, he lurched towards the shimmering mirage, while the sun began to sink below the horizon. His head swam, and he knew he would die soon. But then he heard music? He shuffled faster, and lost his footing as he crested the top of a dune, going into a roll. He came to a stop on a muddy bank, and his eyes focused on a beautiful woman sitting under a date tree, strumming upon a zither. Delirious, he stretched out his hand and called out, "Water, please!" But the woman did not react. She kept playing the zither, and reached to grab some treat from a bowl sitting beside her, eating it daintily while he watched on helplessly. His arm fell as his strength failed. His weight sank him into the silt, and a brackish slurry touched his lips. With his last coherent thought, he swallowed great mouthfuls of watery mud. He awoke in the dark with a pounding headache. His hand was still in the water, and he found the strength to crawl forward and drink greedily from the oasis. It was warm, but he didn't care. It was life itself, and this moment filled him with an almost religious awe. He rolled over and stared at the night sky for a few minutes, or maybe an hour. He lost track of time watching the stars twinkle. He once more heard the sound of music. With great effort, he sat up and looked around. Under the date tree was the silhouette of a woman. "Why did you not help me?" he asked. "I do not wish to involve myself in the conflicts of others," she replied in a melodic voice. "Because I carry a sword? I am a poor excuse for a crusader. I don't have the stomach for war." "That is not what I reference," she said sweetly. "A great bird has been following you. It had not eaten in some time. Now it may starve. I did not wish to harm it to help you." "You would have watched me die to fill a buzzard's belly?" "A bird that kills nothing. It only eats that which is dead already. Why would I starve such a peaceful creature to save one man so eager to risk his own life for the mere chance to end the lives of others, one who has traveled a very long way to do so?" He lowered his head in shame. "You have my faults laid out quite plainly." "Though," she said, with a smirk, "it was a hawk. They travel fairly far looking for prey." Perhaps you aren't as sad to see me survive as I thought, he said with a wink. His hair was coated in mud. His skin was red and peeling. His lips were cracked and bleeding, yet still he felt himself fall into old patterns. Was this his way? Even here and now he'd play a hand despite the long odds. Oh, I am quite saddened, she mused. I could have had a new pair of socks, new to me anyway. You would have stolen them from my corpse? He asked. The dead have no need for such fineries, and no rights to any property at all. The vaults of dead kings are the commons as sure as the pockets of the condemned en route to a pauper's pyre, she said with a rising annoyance. Those also aren't, he stammered. Are such goods to be wasted? Should the vulture or the hawk waste the carrion they find? She pressed, looking for some answer. I suppose not, he said. It seems to be the concerns of misers paraded as justice if I think on it for more than a moment. Life is precious, and death comes to all things as a natural conclusion to it. Both can be true at once. Life and its many pleasures are for the living, and the greatest spiritual pleasure is the freedom it brings. I could also no more steal your agency than I could starve that hawk, she said with an almost zealous tone. How in the high heavens would you have been stealing my agency? He asked, smelling the rank rationalization of self-interest. Were not all the major choices that brought you here, to this oasis in this state, your own? Do you think it would only be free will if those choices brought you to a good outcome? Free will is the greatest gift of the living, to be the charioteers of our own destinies, even if it leads us to ruin. I would prefer no ruin at all, he said dryly. Ruin befalls us all in time. When it does, would you prefer to be the charioteer or the horse under his reins? She asked, with the practiced tone of a scholar or monk. For this talk of choice, that clearly implies a choice to watch me die, to see no value in me as a fellow human being, to gain no pleasure in my existence as a fellow traveler on the ship of life, he said, as he filled his canteen and rubbed a wet hand over his face. You are only a human being until you die, then you are carrion. Your body becomes an empty shell, food for hungry creatures, she said. Something far more sensible for me to spend time with alone in this desert than an armed man. Once more he felt shame. That is sadly true. I know full well the behavior of many of my fellow crusaders. They are convinced that they will be forgiven of all sins, and see no folly in committing a few more to their ledger before it is wiped clean. My own sins that led me here were carnal as well, but for what comfort my words can bring without backing, know that I am not as they are. I can feel the truth in your words, while also knowing that you marched alongside them, despite knowing what they had done and would do again, she said. But make no more false comparisons between the joys of flesh and their crimes. Regardless of your church's dictates, carnal pleasure is not the reason they are evil. So she isn't of the faithful, he thought to himself, confirming his suspicions. I follow the joys of life itself, she said, and if you will no longer link arms with murderers and sadists, I will invite you to sit with me, share the treats of my bowl, and listen to the music I play. He shakily stood up and stumbled over to the silhouette of the tree, awkwardly sitting down with great effort and unable to see through the darkness as the shadow of the date tree blocked even the moonlight. He heard the music stop and saw a motion from the shadows as the woman held out her bowl. It tasted sweeter than any date he had ever tasted, or perhaps it was merely the first time he had paid enough attention to savor its taste and truly appreciate the joy of food. He listened to her soft music and briefly felt his cares melt away. His great weariness caught up to him so suddenly that he found himself unable to stop from yawning and lying upon the ground. His last memory was of a hand caressing his brow. Part 2. He awoke to the bright light of day. There was no sign of the strange woman. Had she merely been a dream, he wondered? The oasis was real at least. He spent a few moments washing himself, then walked a few feet down the shore to drink more water. No longer dying of thirst, he noticed how hungry he was. He checked the date tree. It was barren. She must have brought her own dates, he mused, if she even existed at all. He sighed wistfully before regaining his composure. One problem at a time, he muttered, as he returned his thoughts to the moment at hand. In the distance, he heard a hawk screech. He looked around and saw a tiny black dot in the distance. Perhaps it has found something new. If I am lucky, it is a loose horse. He took another deep drink and began clambering up the dune towards the hawk. As he reached the top of the dune, he paused and looked around in all directions. It would be easy to lose his way back here if any wind covered his tracks. He drew his sword and went to stab it into the top of the dune, but paused at the last second. He might need the sword in case he found a heathen soldier. Instead, he stabbed his sheath into the top of the dune as his marker. He set off for the hawk's quarry. He had traveled half an hour through the blistering heat before he sighted it in the distance. It was another man, obviously a former crusader, and he raced ahead to help. He approached the man, canteen in hand, and slowly poured him several mouthfuls of water. The man rolled to his side, and then slowly stood with great effort. "I am Baron Kopia, and I owe you my life." He studied the Baron, unarmed and wearing tattered rags other than a large gold signet ring. The Baron dusted himself off and tried to project an aura of authority. "I don't suppose there is a caravan or town nearby?" "No. What should we do now?" his rescuer said, for some reason not mentioning the oasis. "We strike out and hope to find one of them," said the Baron. "We still have some strength, and I see you've kept your sword about you. With God's grace, we might just make it out of this." They wandered for an hour, on a tangent to the oasis. The Baron at one point noticed his savior constantly glancing over his shoulder. "Do you suspect we are being followed? Heathens, perhaps?" asked the Baron. "No," said his companion, growing increasingly disgusted by the Baron's very essence. "Were we really planning to use our last ounces of vitality to hunt for random strangers to murder? Is this our noble cause, stumbling through the desert as half-dead bandits?" he thought. He loathed the Baron, loathed that he walked alongside him, and that he had saved this repulsive murderer from the hawk's belly. "What is that in the distance?" asked the Baron, pointing at the sword sheath stuck atop the dune. "I stuck my sword sheath in the sand when I went to find you," said his companion, "to ensure I wouldn't double back." A moment of truth. He did not want to save the Baron for another day. They wandered in the desert for another hour in the scorching heat. The Baron stumbled and asked meekly, "Please, may I have another mouthful of water?" His companion stepped back and drank it all wastefully, water spilling down his chin and neck. "What are you doing?" cried the Baron in confusion, reaching out to stop this act. His companion darted back further. The Baron lunged at the canteen, and once more his target slipped back further. This continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably mere minutes, until the Baron collapsed from exertion, asking, "Why? Why have you done this?" His companion said nothing, and kept just out of reach. Slowly he inched forward, and watched the Baron's slow and shallow breaths. The shadows of the dune from the setting sun inched opposite him, and it seemed as some sort of perverse race as to who would reach the Baron first. The shadows won. The Baron continued breathing until the moon had begun to rise. Only when the body was still did his former rescuer approach the body. "The dead are dead. They own nothing and are harmed by nothing," he said, before feasting on the cool flesh. He thought back to the oasis, and to the beautiful woman who he now remembered in greater detail. He remembered her sunken eyes, and her jagged yellow teeth. He remembered her taloned hands, which had offered her bowl to him. He remembered now the bowl of sweet treats held not dates, but the severed fingers and toes of unknown men. He remembered even more strongly their sweet taste. His face was slick with blood. His jaw ached from the strain of chewing. He ran bloody hands through his hair and felt great clumps come loose in his grasp. He fell to his knees and laughed hysterically with an inhuman bark. On the ridge of a nearby dune, he saw a figure silhouetted against the moon. Was it her? He thought. Did she return to him? Was this some test? The figure moved, and he heard a whistling noise he knew all too well from the battle. There was a pain in his side, and he collapsed into the sand. In his final thoughts, he felt the fear of death and the sorrow of moments unlived, but felt no regrets for the day's events. Epilogue. The archer pulled the gold ring from the stomach that was now sliced open and spilled over the sand. "Marvelous. Thank you for your help in retrieving it." "How did you know it would be in there?" asked the hunchback skeptically. I had seen it glimmering in the sun, replied the archer. The sun has been set for an hour before you shot, said the hunchback, examining the bodies. To save one crusader gives us a guide, and an extra sword for what is to come, he said. To save 3 risks shifting the balance of power in our expedition. The hunchback shook his head. I meant that a ghoul in the dark is a more dangerous thing than a pair of half-dead men in the light. Why not kill them then? The archer looked aghast. Oh, I would never murder a person if I can avoid it. The hunchback. You've never had quarrel with my methods. Which is why we have such a great partnership, he replied, pocketing the ring.